In a village where snow lay thin and gray, an old well waited. No one noticed when a boy slipped inside, and no scream came. Instead, his name rose from the darkness, warm, damp, spoken exactly as his mother had shaped it. The stones were polished not by water, but by bodies, and each new voice stretched the echo longer, as if the well were learning to speak. People realized too late. Here, bodies do not fall. Here, names die. The first time the well spoke, no one was looking at it, and that was how it preferred to be remembered. Snow lay thin and gray across the square, packed hard by boots and carts, old enough to smell faintly of ash and straw. The stone ring of the well rose from it like a scar that had never healed correctly, dark blocks slick with age, their edges rounded in places hands could not reach. The bucket rope hung stiff and angled, frozen where it had been abandoned, fibers locked together as if soaked and dried too many times. The air around the opening felt wrong even before anything happened, slightly warmer than the rest of the square, heavy in a way the lungs noticed before the mind did. The boy had been running, chasing nothing of importance, his boots too thin for the season. Frost betrayed him at the edge. There was no flailing, no cry, just a sudden absence where a body had been, as if the ground had decided to open without sound. The village paused in unison, breath held, waiting for the scream that always came with such accidents. It did not come. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable, long enough for people to begin leaning forward despite themselves. Then the well answered. What rose from the shaft was not a shout and not an echo. It moved upward slowly, like warmth lifting from stone, carrying the boy's name shaped with impossible precision. Each syllable was soft and rounded, damp as if formed against the inside of a mouth. It lingered on the air, close to the skin, intimate in a way sound should never be. Mothers felt it along their throats. Men tasted iron and something sweet at the back of the tongue. No one stepped closer, yet no one stepped away. The well had stood longer than the village remembered. It was said to have been old when the oldest graves were still fresh, its stones dragged from somewhere upriver and set without markings or blessing. Inside, where no light reached, the walls were smooth, polished to a dull sheen that did not reflect but swallowed what little brightness dared to fall. Water sat far below, unseen and unheard, yet the shaft never smelled empty. It breathed out a faint warmth that carried hints of rust, wet stone, and something organic that refused a name. When the whisper faded, the square did not return to itself. Snow seemed thinner. Sound felt reluctant. People avoided the rim without discussing why, circling wide as if the ground there sloped inward. Someone noticed that birds had scattered from the nearby roof and did not return. Another realized their hands were trembling, not from cold, but from a pressure behind the sternum that had no clear cause. They pulled the rope once, slowly, testing. The bucket did not rise. It felt heavier than it should, resisting without strain, as if held rather than caught. When they let go, the rope slid back into stillness, fibers creaking softly, warm against the palm. By nightfall, the boy's name was still present in the square, not as sound but as residue. It clung to breath, to stone, to the thought of the well itself. No one spoke it aloud again, yet everyone heard it when the wind shifted, patient and waiting, as though the darkness below had learned something it intended to use. The well had stood longer than memory allowed, long enough that its origin had dissolved into gesture and habit rather than story. No one could say who set the first stone or why it had been placed precisely there, where the ground dipped slightly and the earth felt dense underfoot. It predated the church, the square, even the path that led travelers through the village. The oldest foundations bent around it rather than replacing it, as if the builders had sensed resistance and chosen accommodation instead. Time did not sharpen its edges. It softened them in places that weather could not reach, smoothing stone where only darkness and pressure lived. Inside the shaft, the walls were worn to a dull polish that caught no light. It was not the slickness of water erosion, but something more uneven, interrupted, marked by faint directional striations that suggested movement downward rather than flow. Fingers brushing the interior stones recoiled quickly, unsettled by the warmth that lingered there regardless of season. In winter, Frost crept across the square but stopped short of the rim, leaving a bare circle of dark, damp stone. In summer, the well breathed cool air upward, carrying the same metallic sweetness that coated the tongue and refused to fade. Moss refused to take hold near the mouth. Lichen bloomed eagerly on nearby walls and roofs, yet the stones closest to the opening remained bare, darkened only by moisture that never quite dried. Roots avoided it as well. Garden beds crept closer each year, but plants near the rim grew twisted and pale, their leaves curling inward, stems thickened as if compensating for pressure they could not escape. When pulled from the soil, their roots were short and knotted, ending abruptly, as though the ground itself had closed around them and refused passage. Birds learned faster than people. They hopped wide of the opening, wings beating hard when startled near it, never landing on the stone lip even when crumbs were scattered deliberately. Dogs circled the square with ears pinned back, pulling against leashes without clear cause. Livestock balked when led too close, hooves skidding as if the ground there had lost friction. These signs were noted and dismissed, folded into the village's quiet understanding that some places simply required respect. Leaning over the well was always a mistake, though no one said so outright. The darkness below did not behave like distance. It rose to meet the eye, flattening perspective, making the shaft feel shallow regardless of depth. Faces reflected back faintly in the stone, distorted and stretched, as if seen through a layer of warm glass. Breath caught in the throat, lungs tightening reflexively, and the taste returned every time. Iron, old sweetness, something intimate and bodily that belonged more to the inside of a mouth than to open air. Those who stared too long reported pressure behind the eyes, a gentle inward pull that encouraged leaning just a fraction further. Hands resting on the rim felt the stone give slightly, not crumbling but yielding in a way that suggested memory rather than weakness. The well did not echo as it should have. Dropped pebbles vanished without sound, swallowed cleanly, leaving no confirmation of depth. Buckets descended reluctantly, ropes creaking with a resistance that did not match weight alone. Over the years, bodies accumulated quietly. Not all at once, not dramatically. Accidents explained each loss. Slips, missteps, moments of inattention. The well accepted them without disturbance. It did not splash. It did not thud. It closed around them with a soft finality that left the square unchanged except for absence. Retrieval was attempted early on, ropes lowered, hooks sent probing into the dark. They returned slick and warm, carrying faint smears that smelled wrong in daylight. After a time, no one volunteered to try again. The stones inside continued their slow transformation. Where bodies passed, the polish deepened, surface irregularities smoothed away. Shallow depressions appeared, elongated and curved, following the general shape of shoulders, hips, skulls. These marks were not sharp enough to name, but they accumulated, overlapping slightly, suggesting repetition rather than coincidence. The well was not emptying itself. It was learning the contours of what it held. Sound behaved differently near it. Footsteps softened. Voices lost sharpness, edges rounded off before reaching the ear. At night, when the square lay still, a low internal hum seemed to settle into the stone, felt more than heard, vibrating gently through soles and joints. It was easiest to notice when lying awake nearby, chest rising and falling in time with something just beneath perception. Memory itself grew unreliable around the well. Names slipped the mind more easily. Faces blurred at the edges in recollection. People spoke of the dead less often, not out of superstition, but because the effort of holding those details felt strangely heavy. Yet the well did not forget. It retained what was offered to it, polishing not just stone but sound, pressure, identity. Each fall refined its interior. Each weight pressed downward, adding clarity to the space that should have been hollow. By the time the village began to sense that the well was not merely old but attentive, it had already woven itself into daily movement. Paths curved around it instinctively. Tasks were arranged to minimize proximity. Children learned where not to run without being told why. The well remained where it had always been, unchanged in outline, yet subtly altered in presence. It no longer felt like a place that waited. It felt like a place that listened, patient and practiced, its darkness close enough to touch without reaching. After that winter, people stopped shouting when they fell, not because they had learned caution, but because something in them understood that sound was no longer theirs to give. Accidents continued with the same quiet regularity as before, woven into daily labor and fatigue, yet the moments surrounding them changed. A shepherd slipped on wet grass near the square and vanished over the rim without a word, his crook clattering once against stone before silence closed. A drunk misjudged the edge at dusk, boots skidding, breath cutting short, his mouth open in the shape of a cry that never formed. A widow leaned too far while drawing water, her weight shifting, rope burning her palms, and then there was only the bucket rocking gently, untouched by splash or impact. Each time, the village heard the same response. Names surfaced from below, carried upward on warmth rather than sound, shaped with a precision that left no room for doubt. They were not shouted and never begged. They were spoken the way one might repeat something cherished to ensure it was remembered correctly. The syllables stretched longer with every death, lingering in the air, overlapping faintly with those that had come before. The well did not hurry. It allowed each name its full shape, rounding consonants, softening edges, releasing them slowly as if reluctant to let them go. The echoes changed as the seasons passed. Early on, they had been simple, singular, a lone voice rising and fading. Now they layered themselves, subtle harmonics threading beneath the primary sound. People began to notice that the well did not repeat names exactly as they were spoken in life. It refined them. Childhood nicknames returned briefly before dissolving. Formal names flattened into something more intimate. In some cases, the well offered variations, as though testing which version fit best before settling into silence again. The square adjusted. People paused longer after each fall, waiting not for rescue, but for confirmation. The whisper became the end of the event, the final accounting. Once the name faded, tasks resumed. Bodies were not recovered. There were no burials, no markers added to the churchyard. Absence folded itself into routine with alarming ease. Fields still needed tending. Bread still needed baking. The well had a way of making loss feel complete without ceremony. Sound elsewhere grew thinner. Bells rang less sharply. Laughter seemed to stop short of its usual volume. Even arguments lost force, voices dropping instinctively as if loudness risked drawing attention. At night, the well contributed its own presence to the silence, a low internal resonance felt beneath sleep. Those who lived closest described it as pressure rather than noise, a gentle compression synchronized loosely with breathing. Dreams became dense and repetitive, filled with images of narrowing corridors, warm stone, and names drifting past without faces attached. Children were the first to adapt fully. They learned not to scream when they fell while playing, biting down hard instead, eyes wide and shining with fear they could not articulate. They learned the weight of names early, how easily they slipped away when spoken to freely. Games avoided the square without instruction. The well entered their imagination not as a threat, but as a rule, something that responded consistently and therefore did not require explanation. The echoes grew longer. What had once lasted moments now stretched into breaths, then into spans of time that made counting uncomfortable. People found themselves holding still, afraid that movement might interrupt the well's careful work. The sound carried more breath than any hollow place should possess. It filled the chest, the sinuses, the space behind the eyes. When it ended, there was a sense of release akin to pressure easing after a storm, followed by an exhaustion that lingered for hours. Some noticed that the well had begun to anticipate. On days when the air hung heavy and damp, when fatigue pulled at limbs and attention wavered, the square felt tighter, paths narrowing subtly. The stones around the rim darkened earlier in the day, warmth seeping upward through soles and bones. It was as if the well recognized the conditions that preceded its offerings and prepared itself accordingly. Attempts to intervene were brief and half-hearted. A railing was erected once, stout and newly cut, its posts sunk deep. Within weeks the wood warped inward, joints loosening without rot, the structure leaning toward the opening as if drawn by gravity alone. It was removed quietly, repurposed elsewhere. A cover was discussed and dismissed. No one wanted to be responsible for closing a mouth that spoke with such certainty. Those who leaned over now did so carefully, compelled by an urge they could not name. They listened for familiar sounds beneath the layered whispers, trying to pick out fragments they recognized. Occasionally, they thought they heard more than one name at once, faint and overlapping, a soft accumulation that suggested the well held its memories close together rather than apart. This realization brought a new kind of fear, not of falling, but of being stored. The well's interior responded visibly. The polished stone deepened in sheen, reflecting torchlight in blurred arcs. Moisture gathered in thin films that ran downward in deliberate paths, tracing shapes that resembled nothing recognizable, yet felt intentional. The air just above the opening remained warm even in cold rain, carrying the same metallic sweetness that now accompanied the whispers. It clung to clothing and hair, followed people home, settled into rooms like an uninvited guest. By the end of the second year after the winter when the well first spoke, the village no longer reacted with shock. Each incident confirmed what they already understood. The well did not hunger. It cataloged. It practiced. Each new name made it better at its task, stretching echoes further, layering breath upon breath until the square itself seemed to participate, holding still, listening along with it. The well had learned that people would stop screaming on their own, and in that silence, it found all the space it needed. Fear arrived quietly, without announcement or spectacle, settling into the village the way damp settled into stone. It did not rush. It adjusted habits first, nudging feet a little wider around the square, pulling gazes away from the well's mouth without conscious decision. Paths shifted almost immediately. Ruts worn by decades of carts softened and disappeared as traffic bent elsewhere. Grass returned in thin, stubborn lines where boots no longer passed. What had once been the most direct route through the village became a space people skirted instinctively, as if the ground there pressed back against them. Children were warned without explanation. Hands tightened on shoulders, directions were given with unusual firmness, and games were redirected before they drifted too close to the rim. No one described what might happen. The absence of detail carried more weight than instruction ever could. Children learned by watching how adults moved, how voices lowered near the square, how laughter thinned and changed shape when it crossed that invisible boundary. They sensed that questions would not be answered and stopped asking them. The rope was replaced first, thick and newly braided, its fibers pale and rough against the hand. It lasted only a short while. Those who drew water felt it resist, not with the expected weight of a full bucket, but with a subtle drag that seemed to travel upward, tightening the arms and shoulders. The rope warmed quickly during use, leaving palms slick and faintly scented with iron. It was cut shorter to reduce risk, then shorter again, until it barely reached the surface of the water. Finally, it was removed entirely, coiled and taken away, its ends darkened and stiff, as if it had absorbed more than moisture. The well did not respond to these changes with silence. It continued to answer accidents with recognition, whispering names upward whenever a body passed its rim. Without the rope, falls became rarer but not absent. People still misjudged space. Fatigue still bent spines. A moment of inattention was enough. Each time, the well offered the same careful repetition, as if acknowledging that precautions had been noted and found irrelevant. At night, the square changed character entirely. Frost formed inside the shaft even in the height of summer, white veins creeping upward along the interior stone, delicate and precise. From above, they looked like cracks in bone or veins beneath pale skin. The frost did not spread outward. It remained contained, as if respecting the boundary of the rim. Outside, the air stayed warm and still, insects humming, leaves unmoving. Inside, the well gleamed faintly, cold and alive. The stones sweated when no rain had fallen. Moisture gathered along the rim and ran downward in slow, deliberate trails, darkening the stone before disappearing into the shaft. The water was warm to the touch, leaving fingers damp and smelling faintly of metal and old sweetness. It did not evaporate quickly. It lingered, soaking into cloth, into skin, carrying the well's presence outward in subtle ways. The air above the opening felt warm against the face, like standing too close to a living body in sleep. It carried a sense of intimacy that made people recoil even as curiosity pulled them forward. Breathing near the rim required effort, lungs tightening slightly, as if the space resisted being filled. Those who lingered too long reported dizziness and a sensation of being gently compressed, as though the air itself had weight and intention. Fear expressed itself in small, practical decisions. Houses nearest the square were abandoned first, their windows shuttered, their doors swelling and warping as if resisting closure. New dwellings rose farther away, built with unnecessary care, foundations laid deeper than required. The church redirected processions. Market stalls rearranged themselves organically, drifting away from the well year by year until the square felt hollow, its center conspicuously empty. Animals reinforced what people refused to say aloud. Cats refused to cross the square at night, skirting its edges with flattened ears. Dogs whined and pulled away, nails scraping stone. Even insects thinned near the rim, the air there quieter, heavier, as if sound itself struggled to exist. On certain nights, a low vibration could be felt through the ground, subtle enough to be dismissed but persistent enough to unsettle sleep. Those tasked with maintenance avoided the well whenever possible. Stones loosened at the rim were left unfixed. Debris accumulated, then was cleared from a distance using tools held awkwardly long. No one volunteered to descend for inspection. The darkness below had grown too close, flattening depth until the idea of distance felt false. Looking down no longer suggested falling. It suggested contact. The well began to influence time. Moments stretched near it, minutes thickening into something difficult to measure. Tasks performed nearby took longer, hands moving more slowly, thoughts drifting. People found themselves forgetting why they had come, turning away without having completed even simple actions. Memory felt unreliable in the square, details slipping free with disturbing ease. Some attempted to counter fear with routine, insisting on normal use of the space. These efforts failed quietly. The weight in the air made sustained presence exhausting. Chests tightened, shoulders hunched, jaws clenched without instruction. After a time, even the most stubborn conceded, adjusting their paths like everyone else, their resistance eroded by the well's patient consistency. At night, the whispers returned without provocation. Names rose from the sealed darkness even when no one fell, faint and layered, as if rehearsed. They drifted through the square and into nearby homes, settling into dreams. Sleep became shallow, punctuated by sensations of warmth and pressure. People woke with sore ribs and aching throats, as if they had been breathing against resistance for hours. Fear did not demand panic. It did not require screams or flight. It settled into posture, into the angle of shoulders and the pace of steps. It taught the village how to live around absence, how to accept that some spaces no longer belonged to the living in the same way. The well remained where it had always been, unchanged in outline, yet its presence now extended far beyond its stone rim. It pressed into daily life gently but persistently, a reminder that recognition could arrive without invitation and that once given, it was never withdrawn. By the time the priest ordered it sealed, the village had already learned the truth their prayers carefully avoided. It had revealed itself slowly, not as revelation but as adjustment, a series of small understandings that settled into the body before the mind could resist them. Names mattered more than bodies. Weight mattered less than recognition. The well did not begin with flesh. It began with the sound that made flesh belong to the world, the breath-shaped mark that allowed a body to be called, remembered, summoned. The priest arrived at the decision late, after petitions and blessings had lost their effect, after incense had failed to mask the metallic sweetness that clung to the square. He spoke of danger in measured tones, of prevention rather than judgment. No one argued. The order felt ceremonial rather than corrective, a gesture made to acknowledge something already concluded. Stones were gathered from nearby fields, heavy and irregular, still bearing traces of soil and root. Mortar was mixed thick and pale, smelling of lime and wet earth. The work was done in silence, not out of reverence, but because voices felt inappropriate so close to the well. As the sealing began, the square responded. The air grew denser, pressing gently against faces and chests. Tools felt heavier than before, handles warm and faintly slick. Each stone placed across the opening seemed to resist for a moment, then settle with a subtle shift, as if aligning itself to an unseen curve below. The well did not whisper during the work. It listened. Those closest felt a faint vibration through their hands, a low internal hum that traveled up arms and into the ribs, sinking briefly with breath before fading again. When the final stone was laid, fitting tighter than expected, the mortar smoothed carefully into every seam. The ground trembled faintly beneath their feet. It was not a jolt but a long, shallow movement, like a deep exhalation traveling through packed earth. The sealed circle released a warm breath that brushed ankles and calves, lingering just long enough to be felt before dissipating. The smell that rose was familiar now. Iron, old sweetness, damp stone. It carried no threat. It carried completion. The square stood quiet afterward, altered in ways that were difficult to name. Without the dark opening, the space felt flatter, yet heavier. The sealed stones were warm to the touch, retaining heat long after the sun dipped below the roofs. Moisture gathered along the edges of the new masonry, beading and running downward despite the dry air. No one attempted to wipe it away. The work was declared finished, and people dispersed with relief that felt brittle, easily cracked. That night, sleep came reluctantly. Dreams arrived dense and immediate, pressing inward without transition. People dreamed of standing in familiar places while hearing their names spoken from beneath their feet, not shouted, not demanded, but offered gently, with certainty. The voices in the dreams did not belong to strangers. They carried the precise inflections of mothers, of siblings, of long-dead friends. They knew the correct order of syllables. They knew the pauses. In the dreams, the names did not pull bodies downward. They pulled attention, drawing it inward, narrowing the world until only listening remained. Some woke with tears they could not explain. Others woke with their names on their lips, whispered unconsciously into the dark. A few woke gasping, ribs aching as if they had slept beneath weight. None spoke of it openly. Morning arrived as it always had, and routine reasserted itself with stubborn insistence. Bread was baked. Animals were fed. The square was crossed again, cautiously at first, then with growing confidence. For a short time, it seemed to work. No accidents followed immediately. The sealed wall did not answer with whispers. The square regained some of its sound. Laughter returned in thinner forms. Footsteps grew firmer. The village told itself a story of containment, of danger neutralized through decisive action. The priest offered prayers of closure, of boundaries restored. People nodded and listened, eager to believe that stone and mortar could impose finality. Yet something subtle had shifted. Names felt heavier when spoken. Calling across a room required effort. Parents hesitated before shouting for children, choosing instead to walk closer, to touch shoulders. Introductions became awkward, voices faltering slightly on first syllables. Even familiar names carried a faint resistance, as if sound itself hesitated before leaving the mouth. The sealed wall continued to exert pressure. The stones remained warm regardless of weather. Frost avoided the circle in winter, stopping abruptly at its edge. Rainwater gathered there, forming shallow pools that never fully dried, their surfaces faintly reflective, distorting faces that leaned too close. People reported a sense of compression when standing over the sealed mouth, a gentle inward pull that made breathing feel deliberate rather than automatic. Dreams persisted. Over time, they grew more specific. Some heard not only their own names, but others layered beneath, faint and overlapping, as if spoken from different distances. A few dreamed of forgetting their names entirely, standing mute while something below waited patiently, untroubled by the delay. These dreams left behind a residue of unease that clung through the day, dulling concentration, shortening tempers. The priest insisted the seal remain untouched. He spoke of patience, of allowing the ground to settle. He warned against curiosity, against testing what had been closed. His voice, once steady, now carried a strain he did not acknowledge. He avoided the square whenever possible, redirecting his path like everyone else. The authority of his order rested increasingly on repetition rather than confidence. It became clear, slowly and without spectacle, that sealing the well had not ended its work. It had changed its method. Without an open mouth, it no longer required falling bodies or accidental weight. It listened through stone and soil, through vibration and breath. It gathered names as they were spoken freely, carried outward into the night, absorbed by ground that had learned how to hold them. The village began to understand the cost of closure. By denying the well bodies, they had offered it something more portable, more abundant. Sound traveled farther than flesh ever could. Names passed easily from mouth to mouth, from room to room, from dream to waking thought. The well did not need darkness visible to do its work. It had been taught how to listen without it. On the night the final stone was laid, the village believed it had finished something. In truth, it had completed the well's education. What exhaled beneath their feet was not satisfaction at being silenced, but acceptance of a new condition. The mouth was closed. The listening remained. Years later, long after the village thinned and roofs sagged inward like tired shoulders, the hill above the square became a place of brief rest rather than memory. The road still passed nearby, though it no longer served trade as it once had. Travelers used it out of habit, following lines drawn by older maps, unaware that the land beneath those lines had learned new uses. They pitched their bedding where grass grew uneven and the ground felt inexplicably warm even after cool days. Sleep came quickly there, heavy and dense, as if the soil itself encouraged surrender. The pressure beneath their blankets was subtle at first, easily mistaken for packed earth retaining heat. It rose slowly, an upward insistence felt through bone rather than skin. Those who shifted found no relief. The sensation did not follow movement. It met them where they settled, patient and precise. Breath grew shallow without panic, chest tightening just enough to register. The warmth carried no comfort. It felt attentive. Travelers spoke their names aloud before sleep for ordinary reasons. To mark themselves in unfamiliar places. To reassure companions. To hold on to identity in the dark. The habit was old and unexamined. The hill received these offerings without sound. No whisper rose. No echo answered. The ground remained quiet, giving nothing back. That silence was mistaken for safety. Morning brought exhaustion that felt disproportionate to the night. Throats ached as if from prolonged strain. Voices emerged roughened, reluctant to shape words. Memories blurred at the edges, recent thoughts fraying first. Names were hardest to retrieve. Travelers paused mid-sentence, fingers tapping against knees, brows furrowed in effort. The missing syllables returned eventually, but altered, flattened, less certain. They laughed it off, attributing the sensation to poor rest, to damp air, to age. Those who lingered another night worsened. Sleep grew deeper and less restorative. Dreams pressed inward with increasing specificity. Some dreamed of standing on the hill while the ground beneath them expanded, breathing gently. Others dreamed of being called, not by sound, but by recognition itself, a certainty that something below knew exactly who they were and required no announcement. Waking brought a sense of having been observed closely, catalogued, retained. The well no longer needed an opening. The sealed stones in the square below had long since been covered by soil and weeds, their warmth diffused but persistent. Roots bent around them, avoiding direct contact. Earthworms clustered nearby, then died in dense knots. The listening had spread outward, traveling through packed ground and bedrock, adapting to distance. It did not strain. It waited. Over time, fewer travelers chose the hill. Stories circulated without clear origin. Tales of restless sleep, of waking with a name missing, lodged just out of reach, of a feeling like being slightly hollowed, as if something essential had been scooped cleanly away without pain. These stories lacked drama. They spread slowly, carried by tone rather than detail. Maps were redrawn subtly, campsites shifted by instinct rather than instruction. The village below continued to decay. Houses collapsed inward, their contents sinking into dust. The church roof caved, beams snapping with finality that echoed faintly through the ground. No one returned to repair or reclaim. Yet the hill remained curiously intact, grass stubborn, soil compact and warm. Animals avoided it, choosing less comfortable ground nearby. Birds circled but did not land. The space held itself. The listening grew refined. It learned to distinguish between names spoken casually and those offered with intention. It learned cadence, hesitation, emphasis. It learned how memory attached itself to sound and how easily that attachment could be loosened. It did not need repetition. One offering was enough. The name entered the ground and stayed there, not stored as sound but as pattern, as something recognizable and retrievable. Those who lost names entirely did not always notice at first. They sensed absence as inconvenience. Introductions failed. Familiar greetings felt wrong. Others stumbled, searching for words that should have been automatic. Over time, identity softened around the gap. Without a name to anchor memory, details slipped free more easily. Faces blurred. Places lost weight. People drifted. The listening did not hurry. It did not take everything at once. It removed just enough to ensure return. Those who left the hill carried a faint pull within them, a subtle orientation toward that place. They dreamed of warmth beneath their feet. They found themselves speaking their names aloud in empty rooms, testing them, reassured by the sound even as it thinned with each repetition. Generations passed. The road changed course. New settlements rose elsewhere. The hill remained, unmarked and quietly avoided. The ground there continued its work, absorbing offerings made without understanding. No one fell. No one needed to. The well's education was complete. What had begun as a mouth learned to become an ear. What had once required depth learned to operate through proximity alone. Names moved through the world constantly, spoken freely, carelessly, lovingly. The ground listened everywhere, but it listened best where it had first been taught. On certain nights, when the soil was warm and the air still, the hill seemed to breathe. The movement was too slow to see, too gentle to alarm. It pressed upward slightly, then relaxed. Those sleeping nearby shifted unconsciously, adjusting to the rhythm. Beneath them, the earth held what it had gathered, content not with silence, but with accumulation. The well had not been sealed to end it. It had been sealed to let it grow.